Described as a historian, an author, a musician, and an artist. So a bit of a Renaissance guy. So if I say any more, I'll be taken away from him. So I'm going to turn this over to Pat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to start by saying that I'm humbled, and that may not be the right word, it sounds hokey, but I'm humbled by the interest that I've gotten in this book that I'm writing, and also by the number of people that are here. I really appreciate y'all coming. You know, I'm gonna.
Could you speak just a little louder?
I'm gonna talk about a lot of things. I'm gonna talk about the book, but there's no way for me to really talk about the book without going into my family background some and that kind of thing. So, I was born in 1949 in Bay St. Louis. At King's Daughters Hospital on Carroll Avenue. Doc Marion Wolf brought me into the world. He probably delivered 3/4 of the babies in Bay St. Louis for 50 years. And at any rate, the way this project started was my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, was named George Stevenson. And my grandfather was a businessman in downtown Bay St. Louis from the 1930s on. My mother's family was from New Orleans, and my grandfather and grandmother moved over here in 1922. My grandfather commuted back and forth until he got laid off in the Depression. When they got laid off, he was over here. Him and Dr. Wolf's brother, Townsend Wolf, started selling a business on Main Street down in the 300 block, selling coal and firewood to the WPA camps, which were in the area during and after the Depression, building schools and bridges and all that kind of stuff. From there, he opened Stevenson Radio and Electric, which was in a building. This was my grandparents' first home. That's my grandmother Stevenson, my mother when she was about 2, and then my grandfather Stevenson. My grandfather, that was their first home on Sycamore Street in the first block. This was when my grandfather first opened his business at 213 Front Street, which was South Beach. At the time, there was 3 or 4 buildings that were on the water side across from Merchants Bank in that area. And he was in a building that he rented from a lady named Josie Welch. The lady's name was Josie Welch, and he rented the building from her. That's the building. And my grandfather's business was in the right-hand side. That's my grandfather Stevenson in the doorway of the building on South Beach. My father's family was the Murphy family. They were from the Stennis Space Center area of Hancock County, called Gainesville or Napoleon. And my grandfather had a number of brothers, 3 or 4 of them farmed alongside of my grandfather Murphy. That's my grandfather Murphy in the center with the light suit on. He was on the president of the Board of Supervisors for a number of years. He was also president of the school board for a number of years. And they had to move out of there when Stennis opened a test site. This is my grandfather Murphy's home in Napoleon. This is the home that I grew up as a child. spending time and loving. This is the barnyard for my grandfather's home, and on the left-hand side is the lane. The lane went on back to a work tool shed and pig pens and all that kind of stuff. But that is also a lane, many of y'all know of the Napoleon Cemetery, but the Napoleon Cemetery is actually owned by my family. And today, this is the lane going back to the Napoleon Cemetery. You'd really never know anything was ever there unless you might go way back up in the woods and find some kind of remnants of tools or something like that. But the whole area is just completely overgrown. It's beautiful, but it's completely overgrown. So my father, this is my father, Pat Murphy Sr. He went to work for my grandfather Stevenson in 1947 when my mother and he were married. And this is him working a trade show at the old Bay High Gym on 2nd Street over there. This would be early 1950. I had polio when I was 2.5 years old, and I was put in it was a charity hospital, but they named, it was called the Polio Center at that time because there was so many people that had contracted polio. And this is a picture of my dad and me when he was visiting me in the polio center about 1952. I was only in there for about 6 months. I recovered as best you could recover and came home, and beyond that basically lived a completely normal life, you know. This is my mother and father and my younger sister and myself. You can see the Stevenson electric truck in the background. That was before my parents had an automobile, and we were out at Napoleon visiting with my daddy's parents. About 1957, 58, my daddy built a house in the 2nd block of Felicity Street. At the time, it was still a dirt road, and this is a picture of my dad and myself, my middle sister, and my baby sister Carlene on the front steps of the house. This was probably about 1958. This is a picture of my dad's home on Felicity Street. Of course, it was destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. You know, I talk about the Bay St. Louis and my childhood and how it was just, it was you could not have wished for a better, more wonderful place to grow up and live in. I talk in the book a lot about that. I talk about that, you know, everybody knew everybody, and even if they didn't know you, they knew of you. And, you know, as kids, we couldn't do anything in town without getting back to my parents before, or my grandparents before I got to them. And, but it was a atmosphere that you know, you could let your kids run, you could let your kids roam, and everybody watched out for everybody else's children. And this is a photo that just, to me, it demonstrates this a lot. This is Ronnie Buffkin, Johnny Buffkin, and Connie Buffkin, and they lived up there on 2nd Street, the Mountain Street area, and they were down at Miss Toomey's Snowball Stand, which is in the 400 block of Main Street, just past Edmund Fay. You know, they're just barefooted and no shirts, and they just, you know, that was life in Bay St. Louis in the 1950s. You know, growing up, the Bay St. Louis of my childhood, the downtown area was vital. It was vibrant. There was lots of things. Anything that you needed or wanted was in that downtown area. And this is a picture of North Beach Boulevard before the 47 hurricane. This is circa about 1946. And if you look, the 200 North Beach building is on the right-hand side with the Seacoast Echo sign, and then right underneath it is G.F. Stevenson Frigidaire, and that was my grandfather Stevenson. And the A&G Theaters right across the street, and if the billboard says the Fighting Seabees were playing. But at any rate, this is what North Beach Boulevard looked like. This is South Beach Boulevard looking north in about 1964. You know, and yeah, the buildings were run down, and it was, but like I said, everything that you needed was right there. From the drug stores to the grocery stores to the restaurants to the drug, you know, you name it, it was there. And, you know, and then as it got further along, this was North Beach facing Main Street in 1966. But what I said about how I came to write this story is that, you know, downtown Bay St. Louis prior to Hurricane Camille in 1969 was taken granted for by everybody. They just, it had always been there. It always would be there, you know, and nothing would ever change. And overnight in August of 1969, the entire beach side of Beach Boulevard was wiped out, except for that one building you see on the right that the whole back side of it washed away. I mean, there was just literally nothing left. These two guys in the photo were two friends of mine, and ironically, myself and those two had, as kids, you know, the hurricanes were exciting, and you always wanted to be out in the excitement. You didn't want to be cooped up in your house, you know. And so when Hurricane Camille came along, us three joined the civil defense. Nobody's going to tell us we couldn't be out in it. And we were out in it. And I ended up, they sent us to the Kill to bring cots and go rescue people and do all this kind of stuff. But at some point we ended up back at the courthouse, and all the windows were blown out of the courthouse. All the plaster was coming off the walls, which meant that the whole building was shaking. They locked the women and kids in the jail when the eye came through, because that was the strongest part of the building. And I went in the Board of Supervisors room about 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, and crawled up underneath the boardroom table and laid there and kind of went to sleep, thinking that if the building caves in, at least this table may save me from being crushed. But anyway, my first memory talking about this with those guys is when we walked out of the courthouse. We walked down the front steps, and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. And it had to be 300 degrees and 250 humidity. And we walked out down the front steps of the courthouse, out into the middle of Main Street, and looked right towards the beach. And I could see water. And I went, uh-oh, you know, and you could never see water before. So that's what it looked like. This was several months after Camille, after they started cleaning up. But my grandfather built a building on Main Street. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. My grandfather built a building on Main Street in 1954, the Stevenson building, which is still there. It's the yellow concrete block building at 126 Main. And he moved his appliance business and his electrical contracting business there. He also rented to the telephone company, and he rented to the draft board. And about a year after that, he built a big, huge warehouse on the back of the building. And so it was a great place for kids to play and grow. We could play back in the warehouse, hiding out and all around the crates of refrigerators and all that stuff. And but one of the things I was going to say is that all those buildings along Beach Boulevard, they were built at street level or sidewalk level, but they were level out and on stilts or piers underneath them. And we used to go up under there and play, and that was like this magical, mystical place. It was all overgrown with, they had thousands of pigeons and snakes and rats and all this kind of stuff kids love, and our parents had all threatened us with death if we got caught up underneath there. And I'm laughing looking at Donald Gaffney back there in the back because he was in on that. And but it was a magical place to grow up. After Camille, DeMontelsen's drugstore was my favorite of the old businesses in downtown Bay St. Louis. And the whole business, we were just gone overnight, nothing left. And Rene DeMontelsen went to my grandfather and asked my grandfather, because my grandfather's showroom in the front of the building had gotten trashed, the windows blew in and everything. So Rene talked my grandfather into allowing him to open his drugstore and renting the front of the building out to him. So my grandfather moved his business into the back of the store. And but this is Rene and Emily and Lorraine DeMontelsen with one of Rene's cousins from France. It was Bastille Day, and this was a year or so after they moved into the front of the building. Rene died of a heart attack. I'm not exactly sure. I think about 1974 or something like that. And the business closed, and then it was a dress shop and things. And then by 1980, we had moved back up in the front of the building. But this is my grandfather and a tenant of his, Dr. Horniff, who was a dispensing optician that rented from him. This was about 1973. And this is in 1977, my grandfather had always told me, one day this business is going to be yours. It's going to be yours. And so my whole life, I looked forward to going into business with my grandfather. Well, in 1977, he brought me in as a partner into the business. And my grandfather, you'd have to understand, was a tight old Scotsman. He didn't part with money easily, and he was never great about saving money and those kind of things. And when I wasn't in the business too long before Monty Electric Supply opened up out in town, and I'm not going to say they had unlimited funding, but they had more funding than we did. And so my grandfather, we struggled along, and my grandfather died in 1982, but by 1982, the business was doing pretty well, but we were still heavily in debt. And by about 1985, I ended up closing the business and going to work for somebody else. But one thing I was going to talk about was the downtown area. A lot of us didn't realize at the time the signs of the downtown area dying. I was thinking about my grandfather's electrical contracting firm did the electrical on the Winn-Dixie, the TG&Y, Gulf Chevrolet when it moved out to the highway. And all of those, not that it wasn't a good thing, but all of those were nails in the coffin of downtown Bay St. Louis. And, this is long before downtown development districts and Main Street programs and all that kind of stuff. And thank God that after I closed my business, Jerry Dixon came into town, and Jerry just had a vision, and he ended up buying the building from us, but he really got the whole arts thing in Bay St. Louis started. But you know, I just wanted, when I started writing this book, it started out as a tribute to my grandfather. And don't get me wrong, I love my daddy's parents, but my grandfather Stevenson was really, really involved in my life. So it started out as a tribute to him, but it very quickly grew into something a lot more than that. And so, you know, I started writing just memoirs and different things about visions and things that I remembered about Bay St. Louis. And it was before Hurricane Katrina, that I went to Ellis Anderson and I said, Ellis, I have written an article about downtown Bay St. Louis and, you know, and my grandfather and the way things used to be and all this kind of stuff. And Ellis was, he wasn't critical, but he was less than supportive. And finally, Randy Ponder, who I was friends with, him and I got to talking, and Randy said, look, we'll print it. He said it is long because it was over a page, 2 pages and that kind of thing. And he said it's taken up advertising space. And I said, well, you know. But at any rate, they printed this and they got this huge response to it. I mean, it just struck a nerve that people in the remembrances of what old Bay St. Louis used to be like. And so from that point, I started kind of getting more organized, and I started writing, getting it a little bit, just pursuing it, getting it more organized. But there were periods when I laid it down, I didn't pick it up like I should have. And Ellis Anderson is somebody that I'm friends with, and one day I just came up with this idea, this is after Katrina, that possibly if Ellis would publish a chapter a month with photos and stuff in the Bay St. Louis Shoe Fly, that would be a way to force me or to write a chapter a month, to turn in a chapter a month to her. And it's changed. I mean, what Ellis published is not exactly the same as what the book is, but that was a way for Ellis for me to get, you know, not educated, can't think of the word. Motivated, there you go, thank you. You know, it got done that way. And as time went on, I kept trying to pursue it. I tried to come up with getting a publisher for the book, and I dealt with a couple of publishers, and 2 or 3 of them didn't have any interest in it at all. And one guy from Georgia we went back and forth for about 6 months, and then he told me he wasn't doing anything else on it until I sent him like $5,000 or $6,000 to start the editing process. And I went, I ain't got $5,000 or $6,000. And so that fell through. But as time went on, I started looking at self-publishing. And Ellis helped me with some different people that do self-publishing and that kind of thing. And that's really how it got to where it is. You know, the Historical Society has been so helpful through the years with me. You know, my friend, and it's funny, I look around in this room and the people in this room and people that are so involved in the Historical Society, and you know, Georgie Martin has been invaluable to me as a friend and helped me. And Georgie Martin was the first real date in my life that I ever went on. She double dated with me and Ellen McDonald, and Margaret Surratt back there was my best friend in the Boy Scouts older sister. And like I said, Donald Gavaney and I were running mates from probably first grade on. And it's just that's what's so wonderful about living in a small town. And you know everybody. Everybody knows you. And that, it's changed. There's new people have come in, and that was another thing that got me so fired up about writing this book, was that really after Katrina, but first of all after the Hurricane Camille, but especially after Katrina, the gazillion people that were moving into this area did not have a clue what this place was ever about. All they saw was the beach, and it's quaint, and it's nice, and it's artsy, and all this. And those are all wonderful things, but the small town aspect of it just is to me a blessing from God. It just I can't talk about it enough. I'm going to talk a little bit about the chapters in the book. There's 17 chapters plus a preface. The chapter 1 is my introduction to Bay St. Louis, meaning my birth, my early childhood. I delve into my grandfather's store and that kind of thing. Chapter 2, I talk about my New Orleans connection, the drive to and from the Bay. And in that chapter, I talk about that, my grandfather's whole family was from New Orleans, and I would go over there in the holidays and summers and stuff and spend, 3 weeks in Mid-City going to, Jesuit summer camps with my cousin, or going to Tulane summer camps with my cousin, and just running around Mid-City. It was at Banks and South Jeff Davis Parkway was where they grew up. But, it was just, we go to Pontchartrain Beach and all of that kind of stuff. And, I talk about my memories of going to New Orleans at Christmas time, and Canal Street, the way Canal Street used to be at Christmas, and being cold and having your nose pressed up against that cold glass, to see Mr. Bingle and the Christmas displays on Canal Street. And I talk about the drive over there and the various landmarks and things that used to be there, and in the city and on the road to and from. Then chapter 3 is the downtown Beach Boulevard experience, which I talk about Beach Boulevard basically from Almond Avenue, which was Highway 90 at the time, down to Washington Street, because that was the main business area of town. There was some in the Depot district, but I talk about that also. But some of the homes and things, just beautiful old homes that were on Beach Boulevard. And I talk about DeMontleson's drugstore, because DeMontleson's drugstore was, when you walked in that place, it was like stepping back into a time warp to the 1890s. Everything was, they even had one of those old stand-alone, stand-up-on free scales to take your weight and that kind of stuff. And, the houses and different things, the churches, St. Stanislaus, St. Joseph, all of those things on Beach Boulevard. Then I taught in chapter 5 is a depot area, which I talk about the depot area, and from Washington Street and Nikkei and all back in that area. And then I talk about in chapter 6 the restaurants and the bakeries, and I talk about Maneri's restaurant and Broadview Restaurant, and Bressler's Cafe that used to be on Main Street. You know, and then the bakeries. Not only was it the Bobby Ann that everybody fondly remembers, but it was the Gold Medal Bakery, or before it was the Gold Medal, it was the Sanitary Bakery, and it was at the corner of. I thought that was kind of odd name, but that was what the name was. But that was at the corner of Hancock and Washington Street, and there were other bakeries and things too, and I talk about how those bakeries developed and where they came from and that kind of thing. Chapter 7 is the clothing department stores and picture shows, and I talk about, you know, Delph's and Ramsey's and the Sea Chest and the Prince's Shop and you know, the picture shows from you know, the Star Theater, which before it was a Star Theater was the Artie Theater, and then the A&G, and I talk about some of the versions of the A&G when it was a place called the Purple Pickle, and they used to have live music in there after the A&G closed. And then I talk about the courthouse, the law firms, politics, crime, and the barbershops. And you know, the courthouse has always been the anchor of downtown Bay St. Louis. The courthouse and the post office. When the post office left and went out on the highway, that was really the death knell. But hopefully the courthouse, that won't happen. But I talk about various crimes that took place in Bay St. Louis. The one that sticks out in my mind is Charles Flink, who was a friend of mine's uncle, got murdered by a guy named Dale somebody. Anyway, and they arrested him, and he had like 3 trials, and he was convicted, but then he went to prison, and he was made a trustee, and one day he just walked away and never came back. But you know, and Dale Morris, that was his name, Dale Morris, the women in Bay St. Louis went gaga over this guy. They had when in his trial, I'm not gonna say who it was, but there was one prominent woman, actually from Waveland, who was so gaga over Dale Morris that the courtroom was full and they weren't letting anybody else in. Some kind of way she got up on the roof of the courthouse and tried to sneak in through the window, a little square window in the women's bathroom, and got stuck in the window. But I mean, it was really a lot of like irregularities and things. They were letting women in his cell and visiting with him, and they were bringing him food and all this kind of stuff. It was really crazy. But anyway, and I talk about the barbershops, we all remember it from here. They used to be on the beach and all over the place. Then the chapter 9 is the hotels, the grocery stores, and the bars. And I mainly hit on the hotels that were open when I was young, but I mentioned the Pickwick and some of those earlier hotels. My grandparents lived it used to be the Clock Hotel, which is at the corner of Ballantyne Street and Beach Boulevard, 800 South Beach. And my grandparents bought it and made apartments out of it in the early 1940s. And I lived there until my dad built a house on Felicity Street. But, the barbershops the grocery stores. I talk about Mr. Scharf with the Jitney Jungle. I talk about the C&S Grocery, Myers Cash Grocery, Joe Loicana, all of those people. And the bars, Trapani's has always had a special place in my heart because I grew up there because my dad was friends with Frank, and from the time I was a little bitty kid, my dad would walk up in there and sit me up on the bar and get me a root beer and some peanuts, and he'd sit there and drink beer with Frank. But also Trapani's, the first paying gig playing music in my life that I ever played was in the back room of Trapani's for a New Year's Eve job in 1965. But I talk about Bertucci's, I talk about Eddie Marquez's, a lot of different bars. Then chapter 10 is the parades, celebrations, fairs, and dances. And I talk about the not only Crew of Chickapoola Mardi Gras parade, but the Veterans Parade, which was just a huge parade in Bay St. Louis. I mean, it just amazes me that something could have been that big back then and it's non-existent today, especially for veterans. And celebrations, the fairs, the church fairs, the kids fishing rodeos, all of that kind of stuff. We had lots and lots of different things going on for everybody, not only kids but adults too. And then I talk about the dances. That's right down my alley. But we used to have dances at the Knights of Columbus Hall up there on Main Street in the second floor, and the Yacht Club and the Bay Catholic's cafeteria. And great bands. I think back on those days of being able to go see Irma Thomas at a dance with 100 kids there, and Deacon John and Earl King and all, just the cream of the crop from New Orleans. And so we had that going for us too. Plus I have a lot of memories of myself playing music and dances and things. I met my darling wife one night after when we were taking a break from playing a dance, and she walked by and kind of smiled at me, and I said, But anyway, the next chapter is Christmas in Bay St. Louis. That's chapter 11. And I just talk about the town and the Christmas decorations, and the different guys in the town would get together and hang Christmas decorations, and the stores that have punch and cookies, and different stores that have their toy displays and all. My grandfather was a huge toy dealer here in town, only at Christmas. That's the only time he fooled with it, but he had a huge display, and it's amazing the number of people that remember him in his Christmas displays. Then I talk, chapter 12 is those lovable downtown characters and chasing Tarzan in the St. Augustine Seminary. And I talk in the characters about Bobo Carver and Clarence Halpern and Bad News Jeff Fusich and just the Mary Govan, just all of these people, really nice, great people, but they were downtown characters. And chasing Tarzan in the St. Augustine Seminary. St. Augustine Seminary at the time, and it's still pretty overgrown and uninhabited, but back then it was wild. And as kids, we used to go over there, walk in there at 8 o'clock in the morning and come out of there covered with mud from head to foot at 4:30 in the afternoon, just playing war and Tarzan and the brothers. It's crazy to this day and time. You think, oh, this is lawsuit city. One of these kids is going to get hurt and they're going to sue them for everything that's worth. It wasn't like that back then. The brothers loved us, and they were kind to us. And Brother Joseph used to have a leather or shoe shop and he'd let us come in there and make little projects. He'd give us leather and stuff like that. And so it was a lot of fun. Chapter 13 was the drugstores, praline shops, piers, funeral homes, and the ice house. The drugstores, I talk naturally about DeMont Lazen's, but I talk about Dixon's and Fay's back of town, and that kind of stuff. And the praline shops, God, we had 1 million of them. Every Italian family in Bay St. Louis had a praline shop. But they all were on Auburn Avenue until it moved out on Highway 90, and then they all moved out there. And I talk about some of the people that were the proprietors of it and that kind of thing. And the piers, to me, some of my fondest memories of this area is the beautiful, gorgeous old piers that we used to have. To me, the St. Stanislaus Pier prior to Hurricane Camille is just burned into my brain. I mean, there was so many good times and good memories on that pier. I talk about the one big memory of that pier was there was a kid named Eddie Blaze. And Eddie, some of y'all knew him, and he was adventurous. And Eddie Blaze one day, and I don't know how he did it, but he did it. He got his bicycle up on top of the roof at the end of St. Stanislaus Pier and rode his bicycle off the roof of the pier. And the only problem was one of the brothers was walking out on the pier and saw him do it. And I think he was punished for the balance of his natural life. But he always said it was worth it. And I say when he hit the water, he went into the epitome of kid lore in Bay St. Louis, But the next chapter is chapter 14, which is my Cedar Point home. And we moved out on Felicity Street, like I said, about 1958. And it was just a dirt road. And there wasn't but 3 or 4 houses on the whole street. Wendy's, McDonald's daddy's house was one of the only house on the streets. But there's so many good memories. I mean, from before they built the hospital, or before they built what's now Dunbar Village. Talk about my daddy riding by there one day with me in the car, and it was a pecan orchard, and they were getting ready to build the new hospital. And my daddy telling me, just think, son, one day you'll be able to tell people, I remember when that was a pecan orchard. But anyway, it was, I talk about some of the families like the LaRues and that kind of thing that was so prominent in Cedar Point. And the next chapter is chapter 15, which is the hurricanes of my life. And I talk about, even though I wasn't here, I talk about the 1947 hurricane and what I had been able to find out about it. And then I talk about Hurricane Betsy and the fact that when we were kids, we were shut in and the shutters were all closed and the excitement was outside, but we were stuck inside. And then I talk about Camille when we weren't stuck inside. And then I talk about Katrina and my experiences in Katrina. I don't delve into too much that late, but I felt like Katrina was important enough in everybody's memory to express my memories of it. The 16th chapter is Grandpa George's store and little discussion group. And my grandfather, when he moved into the back of his store, Hancock Bank was still there. The bakery was still, the Bobby Ann Bakery was still there, and the post office was still there. And people would come every day to go to the post office, stop and get a loaf of French bread at the bakery, walk down to Hancock Bank and do their banking, and then they'd come back and stop in and see George, you know, and there was this whole crew of old codgers that used to hang out in my grandfather's store, you know, solving the problem of the world and how, you know, talking about how Ronald Reagan would be the savior of the whole world and that kind of, you know, those kind of things. But it was really neat because it was just a real conglomeration of people, and men and women that had known my grandfather all their lives, and it just was a neat little thing. And then the last chapter, chapter 17, is called Life as I Have Known It. And I talk about, you know, my memories of having had polio, what my parents must have had to gone through emotionally. I talk about how I was never treated differently. I was, you know, my parents raised me to believe that if I set my mind on something, there was nothing that I could not accomplish. And my daddy would tell me, if you can't do something, you'll come to realize it, and it's okay. But, you know, my whole life I lived like I was 10 feet tall and bulletproof, you know. I mean, I think back at one-handed climbing up 30 feet up into a pecan tree with the ladder nailed up to just slats on the side, hanging it, going up one hand up into the top of a pecan tree. How I didn't get killed, I'll never know. But, you know, I talk about my music and the people that I've known and loved playing music and influenced me and that kind of thing, and my family and that, all of those things. So, you know, I really feel like as far as a book that encompasses most everything in the time period that I have lived in this place, that it pretty much covers everything. Where we are at right now is that the book, it's going much slower than I ever would have anticipated, but it is in the process of being edited. And this girl that's doing the editing is a real editor. She's not only correcting grammar and that kind of thing, she's saying, you know, if you said this, it would flow better. Or if you move this from here to there, it would work better. That's the kind of editor that she is. And but she told me that the editing process would probably be about 3.5 months. Beyond that, then we've got another 6 weeks to 2 months of to order books and you know, that kind of thing. But I feel like probably by the beginning of the summer, it is a realistic figure. We are right now also looking at printers, trying to get the costs down as much as we can, because unless you print 5,000 books, well, believe me, it's expensive. And so, you know, originally it started out, it was going to be a 11 inches wide, 8.5 inches tall, softbound book, a paperback book. But lately I have been trying or looking at ways of trying to do it as, you know, offer the softbounds. And I mean, it'd be nice, they're just full color and nice covers and all of that. But also I'm trying to work out a way of getting it done in hardbound. I was hoping to have this ready for when I spoke, but we are in the process of working on an Indiegogo funding campaign online. The plan is that we would pre-sell books online through this funding campaign. But the problem is the one that always makes sense tells me that people don't want to wait, especially people that you don't know. People don't want to give you money and wait 4 months for a book. So we've decided we're going to wait a little while before we start the funding campaign. And I'm hoping that we can offer both softbound and hardbound, and you'll be able to buy them through that funding campaign. We'll be doing they'll have books here. Jeremy Burke has talked to me about doing it at the bookstore on Main Street. We're talking about trying to find a bookstore in New Orleans and trying to find a bookstore over in the Covington, Mandeville area somewhere. But the one thing I will say is that I can never express how grateful I am to the Historical Society for the help that they've given us. They've just been, anything I've needed, they've helped me with it. Through the process, we have managed to get a couple of grants, but it takes money. It does, and we are. I don't like to. We are going to be selling the books, but also I'll throw this out there that if you believe in this and like the idea of it, we're not above taking donations on this Indiegogo campaign also. Not necessary, but if you feel so inclined, it would be great. And
I don't think you've talked enough about the photographs.
oh, okay. Well, the book, each chapter contains. I have been since the early 1980s collecting photographs of the area, and this grew about because I started realizing that downtown wasn't anything like it used to be, and so that's why I needed to find this. And I lost a lot of them in Katrina. I was able to get a lot of them back. The Historical Society and myself have been swapping back and forth through the years. I do have to say one thing though, talking about the Historical Society before I forget. I can remember like it was yesterday when my friend Mike McGinnity and I were in the electrical supply when we were back up front, standing behind the counter, and Charles Gray comes walking through the front door of the electrical supply. Now this is about 82, 83, and I don't know exactly when he got here, but it was at some point right in that time frame. And he walked in, and he was made a point of introducing himself to us and telling us all about it. And that's really my memory of Charles Gray. And I have to say that, none of this would have been possible without him. I don't feel like. But anyway, the photographs, every chapter has got wonderful photos in it. And there's lots of photos. I'm still in the process of accumulating photos. I spoke to Lorraine DeMontelson just the other day, and she is sending me some more photographs. And so I'm always looking. I'm chasing. I'm starting to think something that's impossible, but I just cannot find pictures of Beach Boulevard in downtown Bay St. Louis prior to the 1947 hurricane. Now there's lots of them immediately after showing the damage of the 1947 hurricane, but there's a couple of showing Beach Boulevard prior to the 47 hurricane, but that's not much else. So was that okay, dear?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm truly humbled by y'all, the turnout and the interest in this. But I'm proud. I'm happy that it seems to have really struck a nerve in the community, and I feel like I'm doing something good for posterity, you know. And so, thank you very much.